Hello and welcome. We're here today to convey this one important message. Women farm workers in the U.S. agricultural sector are essential contributors to domestic food security, yet face more barriers to safe work environments and social services simply because they are women. Today, our team will present in partnership with Women in International Security our findings on food security in crisis, assessing the social challenges of women farm workers in agricultural America. Women farm workers are essential parts of our food supply chain and integral to U.S. food security. As we can see here, there has been an increase in women farm workers in the U.S. and currently 31% of workers in the agricultural sector are women. However, even though women contribute to a significant share of agricultural production, their efforts and needs are not visible on the men-dominated farms. Therefore, the gender analysis of this study aims to show the role that women farm workers play in food security and recommend policies to properly serve women farm workers. It is important to note that aside from gender, migration status is an important aspect shaping the experience of these essential workers. The findings of our study primarily reflect on situation of H-2A visa holders and undocumented farm workers. An H-2A is a guest worker visa that ties immigrant workers to one or two US employers for a set period of time. With this visa, essential workers do have the right to minimum wage. However, they're excluded from benefits granted by the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Workers Protection Act and tax programs such as Social Security. And without further ado, we're going to get into the details of our project and our findings.
The team utilized a mixed methods approach for this research project. While our qualitative data provides an in-depth understanding of the California farm worker experience, we complemented this with quantitative data to capture the breadth of farm worker experiences across America. The 21 farm workers we remotely interviewed uniformly revealed the hardships on the field and at home. Our 10 key informant interviews affirmed these observations, with an expert noting that having rights is not sufficient. They must be known and enforced to make a difference. This is a crucial policy angle that plays out in our research. We further hypothesized that the woman farm worker's double burden of responsibilities limits her well-being and reduces her productivity. Through our regression, we found that gender and parenting status are significant variables that reduce a woman's ability to work regardless of her crop or state. Finally, to supplement our qualitative findings on COVID-19, we obtained vaccination data through a survey. Based on this mixed methods approach, we have gathered and organized our findings across themes. To start us off, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration does have worker housing requirements. However, the lack of OSHA inspections and failure to enforce these regulations frequently allows overcrowding and health hazards to occur. There is also a shortage of housing in general due to public subsidies and lobbying forces that prevent new affordable housing from being built. Even though H-2A workers are guaranteed housing, employers tend to place them in congested groups of 4 to 6 per apartment. Crowding limits the access to hand wash basins, shower heads, and laundry trays, which are crucial for farm workers who are exposed to pesticides. In the context of COVID-19, it also means that social distancing is impossible. Transportation is similarly characterized by physical crowding for families, but also isolation for women. Women often need transportation to take their child to school and may rely on a supervisor to drive them. The supervisor, often a man, can take advantage of the isolation that the vehicle provides. As such, crowded housing and limited transportation often creates health hazards for farm workers and puts women farm workers in positions that are vulnerable to exploitation.
Now, as previously mentioned by Chazelle, an important finding for our research was that although women don't currently make up the majority of the labor force, the increase in numbers means that we will need to start paying more attention to them if we hope to secure links within the food supply chain. With that in mind, this quote from a farm labor organizer from our research study best highlights the results from the research regarding women farm workers. Women are typically concentrated in less physically demanding tasks. However, that does not mean that they take on less of the responsibility. And often this is not recognized. Again, women farm workers bear the double burden of household and childcare responsibilities on top of their duties at work. Our study found that the absence of childcare facilities makes this especially challenging. Most women either rely on either informal childcare structures, such as extended family and friends, or on women leaders in the community who specialize in providing childcare. This instance in particular has created another subset of women that are not being recognized within the agricultural sector, even though they are necessary for the labor force to function properly. In terms of the pandemic, children are spending more time at home and using up more resources, which has placed women in even more difficult situations. For a woman farm worker interviewed, this meant that her family did not have enough money or have enough food to last them throughout the week. For others, this meant that their work productivity decreased because they could not afford or find childcare services for the hours that their children were not in school. Now, when we discuss labor conditions on farms, our study found that the increased production of labor-intensive crops such as sweet corn and tomatoes has had a large impact on both the physical and mental health of farm workers and their families. Overall, this has translated into longer hours and exhaustion for workers. But for women, this is an enduring challenge when they must leave the field and go home. One woman farm worker mentioned that at some times she would forget that she had a husband. For another, she described the longer hours kept her from watching her 3-year-old daughter growing up. These are all sacrifices that women farm workers must make in order to keep up with productivity. What makes this worse is that even though there are high rates of sickness and injury on farms, as well as clear mental health deterioration for farm workers are ineligible for Medicaid within their states, and health insurance is not provided to them by their employers. Now, by the same token, hardship does not translate into better or fair pay. Analysis of the NAS data shows that on average, women farm workers earn less than $1 than men between 2016 and 2018. Also, overtime is not provided to farm workers due to current labor laws. So all farm workers must work double time just to reach that minimum wage.
We also found that women farm workers are vulnerable because of the power structure on the farm. Generally, individual farm workers are the most powerless. They are organized into crews and are supervised by crew leaders, which we call mayordomos or mayordomas for women in Spanish. Labor contractors communicate between mayordomos and farm owners who have the ultimate control over decisions on the farms. Because most male farm workers have been in the United States longer than the women, they dominate the supervisory roles, the better paid positions, and more of them have legal status because of previous immigration reforms. These enable men with power, especially the mayordomos, to exploit and abuse women farm workers and exclude women from promotions. And because more women are undocumented and are concerned about deportation, they're unlikely to report abuses. This quote from Dr. Lynn Stephan, who's a scholar in migrant farm workers and women's studies at the University of Oregon, tells us how women are multiply vulnerable in the community. 2 reasons why women farm workers are suffering from the adverse labor conditions are: first, federal laws do not protect agricultural workers. Farm workers are still excluded from parts of major labor rights protection laws, such as the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. Farm workers are not covered by overtime payment or protection of the rights to bargain collectively. smaller farms are not even required to pay minimum wage. And the second is the lack of regulatory oversight and implementation of guidelines by OSHA. OSHA is understaffed and lack funding to inspect farms as often as they're expected to. OSHA staff also lacks discretion when investigating on the farms. They lack the cultural understanding of the most vulnerable communities, such as indigenous farm workers who might not speak English or Spanish, or undocumented farm workers who are afraid to reach out to OSHA. This quote is from a farm worker interviewee who noted that OSHA does not provide safe environments for them to report abuses.
We knew prior to our study that women in the agricultural sector experience very high rates of workplace gender-based violence, which includes harassment, sexual assault, and rape. Our study contributes to the existing knowledge base by identifying the specific workplace power dynamics that facilitate the exploitation of women farm workers, particularly the role of foremen, or mayordomos, in perpetuating gender-based violence within the agricultural hierarchy. There are many barriers for women farm workers to report workplace gender-based violence, ranging from retribution, which includes termination of employment, to threats of deportation. Perpetrators manipulate survivors using their positions of authority in the sector into remaining silent. Finally, the topic of gender-based violence cannot be discussed without addressing intimate partner violence, also referred to as domestic violence. Women in the agricultural sector also experience very high rates of violence at home. Workplace gender-based violence does not happen in a vacuum and is influenced and normalized by the prevalence of violence against women within farm worker communities. In some cases, farm worker women will not report violence for fear of losing their jobs, their husband's jobs, facing retribution and/or deportation. In conclusion, women farm workers are essential to the US food supply system and food security, yet face barriers to safe workplaces, housing, transportation, and healthcare. Women farm workers also face discrimination within the agricultural sector, including widespread violence augmented by the agricultural hierarchy. While women farm workers serve as essential workers during the pandemic, they've been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Sadly, while these women are risking their own lives to feed our families, they themselves are facing widespread food insecurity and a nutrition crisis among their children.
Governments and policies have lumped the issues of men and women farm workers as if their experiences were the same. This has led to policies and protection practices that have not been efficient or inclusive, harming the production potential of women and thus that of the agricultural sector. Today, we're highlighting these 4 policy goals to better serve women farm workers. First, in terms of advancing gender equity, the federal government should increase the number of H-2A babies available for women in order to facilitate their access to legal status and decrease their dependency on other individuals, which has often resulted in exploitation. Second, in order to strengthen basic public services, monetary stimulus packages should also go to local organizations, filling gaps in services like childcare, housing, providing food and potable water. Especially during a crisis, women farm workers have struggled the most in providing safe conditions for their families, and this is why this recommendation is important. Third, expanding legal protections through the FLSA Act to include H-2A farm workers would reduce agricultural exceptionalism and provide women with minimum wage, mandatory overtime, insurance, and the right to unionize. Fourth, improving oversight and accountability is essential. Therefore, the government should expand OSHA's mandate to cover gender-based violence, to cover sexual harassment, pesticide use, and on-site sanitation facilities, such as bathrooms, potable water, places to clean your hands, which are currently hurting women farm workers the most. Nonetheless, appropriate funding is essential to make any of these changes take place. And thus, these are some of the recommendations we wanted to highlight for you today based on their timeliness and feasibility. The most important takeaway is that in order to move forward with any policy, women must be accounted for and they must also be understood. Otherwise, policies will fall short as they have historically. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us on our presentation. We will now answer any questions at this time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much to the team and for this, fantastic piece of research. I have a few questions for you, and that relates to one, the power structure of the agricultural sector. It seems to me it's a very sort of patriarchal structure, the agricultural sector. Do you have any sense of the numbers or the gender balance or imbalance in terms of farm owners, labor contractors, mayordomos? I mean, do you have actually any women as foremen? So maybe that question first, and then I have another follow-up question.
Sure, I can take this question. We actually don't have any data on how many of the farm owners are women, and unfortunately, we didn't get to interview any farm owners and look at their perspective. But we do have quantitative data from the NALS data to show that 20% of the supervisory roles are consist of women. And our anecdotal evidence from the qualitative interviews also show that the number of women mayordomas are increasing since the 1970s. So we are seeing more women taking the role as mayordomas, but we hope to see more of them taking this leadership role.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see whether, does the gender of, or the sex of, say, the farm owner or the mayordomo or mayordoma or the labor contractor actually makes a difference in the conditions of the farm workers?
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be fair to generalize to all mayordomos or mayordomas. We actually asked this question to the experts we interviewed, and they said that regardless of their gender, they are really nice mayordomos or mayordomas who are really working for their community and trying to improve their welfare. But we are also seeing mean mayordomos or mayordomas who are very demanding during the harvesting season. But what we heard from the farm worker interviewees is that they do hope, especially the women farm workers we interviewed, they do want to see more mayordomas in their crews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you could probably also look at, some hard data in terms of wages, the amount of wages that are being paid in terms of housing, transportation, how that is organized. And so that you don't have to rely just on the accounts of the farm workers themselves. Another question I had there are two other questions I had. And that is, one is maybe can you explain to me why farmer workers do not benefit from minimum wage regulations? And the second question would be do we have a sense of, farm workers, do they come with their families or do they come alone, or do we have a sense of, what the distribution there is? And if they come with their family, then they indeed come with their children. But I imagine there are a lot of farm workers also without children.
Right, and I think to your second question, I can go ahead and answer. In terms of the farm worker interviews, we found that it actually was a bit mixed. And kind of consistent, again, with the idea that we are talking about women who have to deal with the household responsibilities on top of their work responsibilities. Much of the farm workers who are women often came with their families. However, when it came to men, one particular farm worker mentioned that he had come here all by himself and all alone, and that he had no extended family here. I think what's probably the biggest thing that's so important is that when they do come, they are staying and they are creating that family structure here for a longer term, which makes it even more concerning because, again, they don't have that coverage and making sure that they have a sustained life here. So imagine creating your home here, starting a family, having children, and then not being able to stay or not having the security really of basic living. And that's a main concern for the families.
Mm.
And with regard to the first half of your question about why are farm workers not protected by these labor protections? So it's clear to all of us that these labor protections do exist on some level. The Farm Labor Standards Act protects workers through minimum wage and overtime pay. The National Labor Relations Act grants the right to unionize. There's also a Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protections Act that establishes standards for migrant workers for housing and transportation. But the problem is that there's a loophole in it for agricultural businesses that is known as agricultural exceptionalism. And the way it plays out is that agricultural businesses can be exempt from the requirements, these protections that are supposedly given based on certain definitions. For instance, an agricultural employer who doesn't utilize more than 500 man days of agricultural labor does not have to provide minimum wages and can therefore cut costs by doing so. And also in our qualitative interviews, we learned about practices to avoid overtime pay because, for instance, in California, overtime pay is offered to farm workers. However, labor contractors tell us that in order for growers to avoid paying this higher wage of overtime, they just hire more workers instead. So these farm workers end up having to take their minimum wage pay and search for more jobs just to maintain the same type of income.
That's really incredible, and it also goes to show that we need to pay far more attention to the whole structure of this farm, of the agricultural sector. Any of my colleagues have any further questions?
I do have two questions. So first one is, I know like you guys did your interviews through internet, right? Then my first question is, how did you reach out to farm workers there? Did you hire someone in California, or what's the method you use? And the second one is, I believe it's a little bit sensitive issue to talk about, you know, their status in the US and especially like the gender-based violence. And that's not something easy to talk about. And how did you guys build the trust between you and the farm workers to let them tell you what they have experienced?
Absolutely. And Z, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about our fixers, because they were the core of our project and they provided us with endless support. So we did have a fixer on the ground in California. Her name is Lali, and she is an incredible human being who has been involved with the agricultural sector, has been a farm worker herself. Her mother was a farm worker. She used to wake up at 5 in the morning every day and just tried to provide to her family. And so she had a lot of connections with Líderes Campesinas, which is one of the groups on the ground, and several other groups. She's also one of the people who does a conference on mental health for farm workers, which is an upcoming and trending topic of discussion to deal with their mental health issues in the farm. And so she connected us with all of this. And so she reached out to several groups and had a whole cuadrilla, so a group of women leaders in the farms who gathered farm workers for us. And so they brought all of them to this one site, and it was majorly women. However, we did have a few men. We did ask them to at least have about 1/3 of the population to be men that we would want to interview. And we scheduled separate rooms due to the lack of facilities and money and funding for these people. We had one room that was indoors and one room that was outdoors. Both of them have internet access. And we did our very best on accommodating for Zoom. We spoke with them in the beginning to go over the questions. They reviewed the questions with us to make sure that they were appropriate, and they were also not putting anybody at unnecessary risks, because we did want to maintain the anonymity of all of our farm workers to the utmost. That was one of our most important things, that we wanted to make sure that they knew that they were safe, and that what we wanted to do was uplift them. So when we discuss certain topics that maybe they didn't understand well or they were hesitant on, we always reinforce the idea that this was anonymous, that if at any point we believe that the information they were giving us would be identifiable, that we would exclude it and find other ways of highlighting those issues, because they are important issues, but we wanted to maintain their safety at all times. And so we tried to isolate our interviews to make sure that they didn't have a lot of people surrounding them. However, due to the family structure as a whole, there were dogs, there were kids running around, just because this is one of their centers. So we really did try our best to put them in a safe position. And whenever we saw hesitation to answer to any questions, we understood and we moved on to the next question.
I see. So the trust building process is more between the fixer and the people you interview, right?
Yes, so they all knew our fixers. They were well acquainted with the groups that we were working on, and thanks to that, our report was able to be increased. At the same time, there has been several researches being done by the University of Oregon and other nearby colleges. So there has been an understanding that these reports are being done to highlight the vulnerabilities and to try to bring attention to them. And I don't know if you guys had access to it, but I believe the New York Times did a really big op-ed piece on these farm workers due to these recent research. It's just that ours in particularly focused on women, which is what was lacking from all of these other research. So the report was there thanks to our fixers, and that is why we saw a willingness to speak on the topics and felt safe.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. Thank you guys for a great presentation. I was wondering if you found or heard of any type of protections for female farm workers, particularly single mothers who became pregnant, or if that's just unheard of. Just curious, that might not be in the scope of your research.
Sure, I can address this. There aren't any specific protections for really any type of women, regardless of her reproductive status. They're in relation to actually to pregnancy. There's some really depressing stories from Immokalee, Florida. Immokalee was previously known as the epicenter of forced labor within the United States. It's responsible for 80% of the tomato production within the United States. So it's really critical area for food production. And they've seen a lot of really terrible human rights abuses in this region. One being congenital abnormalities among children. So there have been at least 3 women who, having worked in the fields, exposed to pesticides, gave birth to 3 children with congenital abnormalities. One of the children was born without arms or legs. And this is a real crisis in regard to pesticide exposure. Luckily, Immokalee, Florida has seen a lot of improvements, largely due to the work of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. It's a really amazing group and an excellent best practice to look at. However, this is still the norm across the country. Pesticide exposure is a massive problem, not even within just the United States, but also within the international community. The Sicilian case is an excellent example of pesticide exposure, rape, and abortion, and the ways in which the agricultural sector and the challenges that farm workers face are exacerbated when you add in a gender dynamic. So cases of forced abortion, particularly in Italy, where there's a lack of abortion access due to conscious objectors. We don't have to dive into that, it's a little detailed, but to say that women face really exacerbated challenges, particularly pertaining to their reproductive potential and for their children as well. So as regards to pregnancy, pesticide exposure is one of the largest issues by far.
Great. Well, thank you very much again. I think one of the things that you've also shown in your research is that it's really essential to have a gender perspective when we're looking at these issues. And I think there is a huge arena for future studies looking at the agricultural sector as a whole you know, really applying a gender perspective and having a gender lens. And it will be interesting to see, apparently the number of female students in agricultural school is going up. And my brother-in-law, who's a professor at one of the big agricultural schools, says is actually the majority of students are women. And so it will be very interesting to see to what extent that is going to change the whole sector or not. So I think this is something to be continued. And I think you've done some path-breaking and real trailblazing research here. So thank you again.
Thank you for having us.